April 9, 1942. The Bataan Peninsula, Philippines. Imagine standing in a line with 75,000 men starving, disease-ridden, exhausted beyond comprehension. The tropical sun beats down at over 100 degrees. You haven't eaten a proper meal in months. Malaria burns through your blood. Dysentery has ravaged your body. You can barely stand. And then they tell you to march. Not just a few miles. 65 miles, through scorching heat, without food, without water. And if you fall, if you stumble, if you stop for even a moment, you die. This is the story of the Bataan Death March, one of the most horrific atrocities of World War II. It's a story of courage and cruelty, of survival against impossible odds, and of a nightmare that would scar an entire generation. But before we understand how these men ended up on this death march, we need to go back. Back to when everything began to fall apart. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor, when Japanese aircraft descended upon the American naval base in Hawaii. They didn't just destroy ships, they shattered the illusion of American invulnerability. But Pearl Harbor wasn't Japan's only target that day. In fact, due to the international dateline, the first bombs had already fallen on another American possession, the Philippines. Just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, on December 8, Japanese planes began their assault on the Philippine Islands, particularly targeting Clark Field near Manila, the capital city on the island of Luzon. The attack was devastating. Much of the American Air Force in the Philippines was destroyed on the ground, caught by surprise, despite having received news of Pearl Harbor hours earlier. The strategic importance of the Philippines to Japan's imperial ambitions cannot be overstated. If Japan could control these islands, they would control the shipping lanes of Southeast Asia. They would cut off Allied supply routes and secure their southern flank as they advanced deeper into the Pacific. The capture of the Philippines was not just desirable, it was crucial. Commanding the defense of the Philippines was General Douglas MacArthur, a legendary military figure who had retired from the U.S. Army in 1937 to become a military advisor to the Philippine government. When war threatened, he was recalled to active duty in July 1941 to command the United States Army Forces in the Far East, USA, FFE. Under his command were approximately 80,000 troops, a mixture of American soldiers, Philippine scouts, elite Filipino soldiers in the U.S. Army, and hastily trained Filipino Army divisions. On paper, it looked like a substantial force. In reality, most of these troops were poorly trained, under-equipped, and lacking in modern weapons. The Philippine divisions, in particular, had been mobilized just months before the war began. Many had never fired their rifles. Some units didn't even have enough rifles to go around. Leading the Japanese invasion was Lieutenant General Masaharu Hama, commanding the Japanese 14th Army of approximately 43,000 men. Hama was an unusual Japanese officer, cultured, cosmopolitan. Having served as a military observer with British forces in France during World War I and as a military attaché in London, he had a reputation for being more humane than many of his contemporaries, even ordering his troops to respect Filipino customs and religion. But Hama's humanitarian inclinations would be overwhelmed by the brutality of the men under his command and the crushing pressure from his superiors to complete the conquest quickly. On December 10, just 2 days after the initial air attacks, Japanese forces began landing on northern Luzon. These were probing attacks, testing the defenses. The main assault came on December 22, when over 43,000 Japanese troops landed at Lingayen Gulf on the western coast of Luzon. Supported by tanks and artillery, the following day, another 7,000 landed at Layman Bay on the eastern coast. The jaws of a giant pincer were closing around Manila. MacArthur's forces tried to meet the Japanese on the beaches, tried to hold delaying positions, but they were simply outmatched. The Japanese had air superiority, better equipment, better training, and most importantly, battle experience from years of fighting in China. The Philippine divisions, composed largely of new recruits, began to crumble under the assault. On December 24, Christmas Eve, MacArthur made a fateful decision. He activated War Plan Orange 3, the pre-war contingency plan that called for American and Filipino forces to withdraw to the Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor Island, transforming Manila Bay into a fortress. The idea was to hold out until reinforcements could arrive from the United States. Manila was declared an open city on December 26 to spare it from destruction. As 1941 turned to 1942, a massive stream of military forces and refugees flooded into Bataan, a rugged, mountainous peninsula jutting into Manila Bay. The peninsula was covered in dense jungle, volcanic peaks, and had only 2 roads suitable for military traffic. It was defensible terrain, but it had one critical flaw. It had never been properly stocked with supplies. The original plan had anticipated feeding about 43,000 troops for 6 months. Now, over 80,000 soldiers and 26,000 civilian refugees were crammed into Bataan, and the supply situation was catastrophic. There simply wasn't enough food, medicine, ammunition, or equipment. From the very beginning, the men on Bataan were on half rations. By January, they would be on quarter rations, about 800 calories a day, barely enough to sustain life, let alone fight a war. We were essentially starving to death, one soldier remembered. Men began hunting and eating anything they could find: monkeys, snakes, lizards, iguanas. Even the cavalry horses and mules were slaughtered for food. The rice paddies of Bataan provided some rice, but it wasn't nearly enough. And then there was disease. Bataan was a perfect breeding ground for mosquitoes, and with mosquitoes came malaria. Quinine, the primary drug used to treat and prevent malaria, ran out by February. Soon, nearly every man on Bataan was burning with fever. Dysentery ravaged the troops, leaving men weak and dehydrated. There was no way to maintain proper sanitation in the jungle. The hospital's makeshift affairs set up in ravines and under bamboo shelters quickly overflowed with sick and dying men. Despite these horrific conditions, the defense of Bataan was extraordinary. The Japanese launched their first major assault on the main defensive line on January 9, 1942. They expected to break through quickly. Instead, they were met with fierce resistance. American and Filipino troops, fighting from prepared positions in the mountains and jungles, held firm. The Japanese tried everything: frontal assaults, amphibious landings behind the lines, infiltration through the jungle. Units like the 192nd Tank Battalion, equipped with brand-new M3 Stuart light tanks and made up of National Guard soldiers from Wisconsin, Illinois, Ohio, and Kentucky, engaged in the first American tank versus tank combat of World War II. They fought delaying actions, covered retreats, and held critical positions. The Philippine Scouts, elite Filipino soldiers in the American Army, fought with exceptional bravery. The 26th Cavalry Regiment, Philippine Scouts, conducted one of the last horse cavalry charges in American military history at Rosario, buying precious time for other units to withdraw into Bataan. By late January, both armies were exhausted. The fighting settled into a brutal stalemate. The Japanese, frustrated by their inability to break through and under intense pressure from Tokyo to complete the conquest, made a critical error. They withdrew their most effective division, the battle-hardened 48th Division, and replaced it with the poorly trained 65th Brigade, a garrison unit never intended for frontline combat. For the defenders, February and early March brought a brief, desperate hope that they might actually hold out until reinforcements arrived. MacArthur had promised them. President Roosevelt had promised them that help was coming. Convoys of ships loaded with supplies, planes, fresh troops. Help is on the way, they were told again and again. But no help was coming. The Japanese controlled the sea approaches to the Philippines. The American Pacific Fleet was shattered at Pearl Harbor. There were no convoys, no reinforcements, no supplies. The men on Bataan were alone, and deep down, most of them knew it. On March 11, 1942, under direct orders from President Franklin D. Roosevelt, General Douglas MacArthur left Corregidor Island by PT boat, escaping through the Japanese blockade to reach Australia. He took with him key members of his staff, men who would become known as the Bataan Gang. Before he left, he made a promise that would echo through history: "I came through, and I shall return." MacArthur's departure devastated morale. The soldiers felt abandoned. Their commander had left them behind. Command of the forces on Bataan fell to Major General Edward P. King, Jr., an artilleryman who had served in the Philippines during World War I. King was a competent, caring officer who understood the desperate situation his men faced. In early April, the Japanese, now heavily reinforced and determined to end the siege, launched their final offensive. This time, there would be no holding them back. The starving, disease-ridden defenders simply had nothing left. Units that had been at full strength 4 months earlier were down to a fraction of their numbers. Not from combat casualties, but from disease and starvation. Some men were so weak they could barely lift their rifles. On April 3rd, Japanese forces broke through the main defensive line. The collapse was swift. Within days, organized resistance had crumbled. Major General King faced an agonizing decision. His orders from MacArthur and General Jonathan Wainwright, now commanding all forces in the Philippines, were clear. Do not surrender. Fight to the last man. But King could see what was happening. His men were dying by the hundreds every day, not in battle, but from disease and starvation. Ammunition was nearly gone. Medical supplies were exhausted. A continued fight would be nothing but a pointless slaughter. On April 9, 1942, accepting sole responsibility and fully expecting to face court-martial for disobeying orders, King made the decision to surrender. Approximately 75,000 men, 12,000 Americans, and 63,000 Filipinos laid down their arms. It was the largest surrender of American forces in history. Larger even than the surrender at Harper's Ferry during the Civil War. King wanted to make sure his men understood one critical thing. He told them, "You did not surrender. You had no alternative but to obey my order." The Battle of Bataan was over. But for the soldiers who had fought so bravely for nearly 4 months, their ordeal was only just beginning. They came on April 10th, the day after the surrender. The soldiers who had defended Bataan were scattered across the southern portion of the peninsula, concentrated mainly around Mariveles and Bagak. They had been told to destroy their weapons and wait. Many assumed they would be treated according to the Geneva Convention, given food, water, medical care, and transported to prisoner of war camps, where they would sit out the remainder of the war. The Japanese soldiers who began rounding up the prisoners were operating under a unique and deadly mindset. In Japanese military culture, surrender was considered the ultimate disgrace, worse than death. A Japanese soldier was expected to fight to the death or commit suicide rather than surrender. The idea of becoming a prisoner of war was seen as shameful, dishonorable, a stain on one's family and nation. To these Japanese soldiers, the Americans and Filipinos who had surrendered were not worthy of respect or even basic human dignity. They were contemptible. They were less than human. Making matters worse, the Japanese military had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They had expected to capture perhaps 25,000 prisoners, men who would be in reasonably good health. The plan General Hummer's staff had developed was based on this assumption. They had arranged for some food, supplies, and transportation for about 25,000 men. Instead, they captured nearly 75,000, 3 times more than expected. And these men were not in reasonable health. They were starving, disease-ridden, many with untreated wounds. At least half were suffering from malaria. Most had severe dysentery. They had been on quarter rations for months. Many could barely walk. The Japanese plan, such as it was, called for the prisoners to march from the southern tip of Bataan up the eastern coast road to San Fernando, a distance of roughly 65 miles. At San Fernando, they would be loaded onto trains that would take them to Capas, where they would march another 7 miles to Camp O'Donnell, a hastily prepared prisoner of war camp. In theory, the march was supposed to be conducted in stages, with rest stops, food distribution, and water available along the route. In practice, it became one of the most horrific forced marches in military history. Private Lester Tenney, of the 192nd Tank Battalion, a young man who had manned one of those American M3 Stuart tanks during the fighting, described what happened. We had no food or water. The temperature was about 106, 108 degrees. We were all sick. We all had malaria, dysentery. We had gunshot wounds, bayonet wounds. We were in no position to walk, and yet we had to do that. The march began with systematic brutality. Japanese soldiers forced the prisoners to turn out their pockets and hand over all their possessions. They were searched for anything Japanese: money, coins, souvenirs, flags. If a prisoner was found with any Japanese item, the assumption was that he had taken it from a dead Japanese soldier. The punishment was immediate execution. One American lieutenant, Kermit Lay, recounted. They pulled us off into a rice paddy and began shaking us down. There were about 100 of us, so it took time to get to all of us. Everyone had pulled their pockets wrong side out and laid all their things out in front. They were taking jewelry and doing a lot of slapping. I laid out my New Testament. After the shakedown, the Japs took an officer and 2 enlisted men behind a rice shack and shot them. The men who had been next to them said they had Japanese souvenirs and money. Word spread quickly among the prisoners: hide or destroy anything Japanese. But even this precaution couldn't save everyone. American soldier Burt Bank witnessed a scene that would haunt him forever. One of the POWs had a ring on, and the Japanese guard attempted to get the ring off. He couldn't get it off, and he took a machete and cut the man's wrist off, and when he did that, of course the man was bleeding profusely. I tried to help him, but when I looked back, I saw a Japanese guard sticking a bayonet through his stomach. This was just the beginning. The Japanese herded the prisoners into groups of approximately 100 men and started them marching north up the coastal road. The tropical sun was merciless. Temperatures soared above 105 degrees. The humidity was suffocating. And before the march even began each day, the Japanese subjected the prisoners to what became known as the sun treatment. The men were lined up in rows, forced to stand at attention in the full sun from sunrise until late morning, hours of standing motionless in the scorching heat. By the time the march actually began each day, many men were already at the point of heat exhaustion. It wasn't a march, Lester Tenney said. It was a trudge, as the columns of prisoners shuffled north. The guards walked alongside them, rifle butts and bamboo clubs at the ready. Any man who stepped out of line for any reason to help a fallen comrade, to reach for water from a roadside stream to relieve himself, was beaten. Often, he was killed. The pace was deliberately punishing. Japanese guards would suddenly shout and force the prisoners to run, then walk, then run again. Men who couldn't keep up were beaten and left behind. The road soon became lined with bodies. Men who had fallen and been executed, their corpses left to rot in the tropical heat. During the march, we were formed in 3 lines, and I was always in the middle line because the Japanese trucks were coming up, and they would whack people in the far line with their rifles or whatever they had in their hand, recalled survivor Paul Kirkham decades later. So I found out, stay in the middle line, and I just watched the shoes in front of me. Kirkham could hear the executions happening around him. I could hear the shots, I could hear the screams. Water became an obsession. The men were marching in temperatures that could easily cause fatal dehydration in hours, and they had no water. Along the route were artesian wells, streams, and water buffalo wallows. Muddy, stagnant puddles of filthy water. Desperate men would try to break ranks to drink from these sources. Sometimes the guards would shoot them before they reached the water. Sometimes they would let them drink, then bayonet them as they knelt. Desperate for water, men attempted to drink from dirty and disease-filled stagnant puddles, one account notes. Sympathetic Filipinos alongside the road tried to offer nourishment. However, if seen by a guard, both the POW and the Filipino were shot without hesitation. The Filipino people, watching their American allies being marched like animals along the roads, tried desperately to help. Women and children would run out with food, water, sugarcane, anything they could offer. The Japanese guards beat them back. Some were shot. Amadou Anti, a Philippine scout who was on the march, had hidden a small amount of sugar under his belt, knowing it might be his only source of energy. On the 5th day of the march, burning with malaria, his feet so swollen he could barely walk, Anti faced death. His fellow soldiers urged him to escape. When the Japanese guards momentarily turned away, his comrades pushed him into a roadside ditch. Auntie crawled into the bushes and lay there, expecting to die. Instead, local Filipino civilians found him, nursed him back to health over 3 months, and saved his life. Not everyone was so fortunate. As the march continued, day after hellish day, the deaths multiplied. Men simply collapsed from heat stroke, from exhaustion, from disease. When a man fell, the guards would shout at him to get up. If he couldn't, if he was too weak, the execution was immediate. Sometimes it was a bullet. More often, to save ammunition, it was a bayonet thrust or a beheading. I saw a case where they didn't even holler at him, Lester Tenney remembered. The man fell down, the Japanese took a bayonet and put it in him. I mean, 2 seconds. The bayoneting became almost routine. Japanese soldiers would stab prisoners through the back, through the stomach, and leave them writhing on the road. Other prisoners were forced to march past, not allowed to stop, not allowed to help. There were public executions along the way. Men singled out and killed in front of the marching columns. Poor encourager, les autres, to remind the prisoners what awaited anyone who couldn't keep up. One of the most horrific incidents occurred at the Pantingan River on April 12. Japanese forces, apparently acting on orders from Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, a fanatical officer known for his brutality, rounded up several hundred Filipino and American prisoners, mostly officers and NCOs from various Philippine divisions. They were taken to the riverside, where most were hogtied with telephone wire. Then they were systematically shot, bayoneted, or beheaded. The river ran red with blood. Remarkably, a few men survived to tell what happened. Not all Japanese officers participated in these atrocities. Colonel Takeo Imai, commanding another regiment, received the same order to execute prisoners, but recognized it as a war crime. He refused to obey and did not execute anyone under his command. But for most prisoners, there was no such mercy. The march became a blur of pain, heat, thirst, fear, and death. Survivors later struggled to describe it. How do you convey what it's like to march 65 miles in tropical heat with no food or water while suffering from malaria and dysentery? How do you explain watching your friends die one by one, unable to help them? How do you make someone understand the constant terror of knowing that any moment, for any reason, or no reason at all, a guard might decide to kill you? Lester Tenney survived by setting goals. When he felt himself reaching the point of collapse, he would pick out something in the distance, a herd of water buffalo, a tree, a building, and tell himself, I just have to reach that. That's my goal. Nothing else matters. Just get to that herd of water buffalo. When he reached that goal, he would pick another one. Goal after goal, step after step, hour after hour, day after day. Luckily, I was able to deal with it, Tenney said. I had my problems, same as everybody else. I had a very severe attack of malaria and dysentery that I thought I was dead, but somehow or other I pulled through. Not everyone had Tenney's mental fortitude or physical resilience. Malcolm Amos, an Army corpsman from Afton, Iowa, was among the prisoners. For 6 days he marched with no food or water, watching men die all around him. After about 5 to 7 days, depending on where a particular group had started and how fast they moved, the survivors finally reached San Fernando. But their ordeal was far from over. At San Fernando, the Japanese forced the prisoners into railroad boxcars. These were small boxcars, designed to carry freight, or perhaps 40 people in reasonable comfort. The Japanese packed 100 men into each car. The prisoners were jammed in so tightly that many couldn't sit down. The doors were closed, shutting out air and light. The temperature inside the sealed metal cars quickly became unbearable. In groups of 100 men, the Japanese forced them into boxcars designed to hold no more than 40 people, causing more men to die of heat exhaustion and suffocation. One account describes the train journey to Capas took several hours. Men fainted from heat and lack of oxygen. Some died standing up, held upright by the press of bodies around them. When the doors finally opened at Capas, bodies tumbled out onto the platform. From Capas, there was one more march, 7 more miles to Camp O'Donnell. By this point, the surviving prisoners were beyond exhaustion. Many could barely put one foot in front of the other. But they marched, because the alternative was death. Over the 6 to 10 days of the march, depending on the group, an estimated 7,000 to 10,000 prisoners died. The exact number will never be known. Many bodies were left along the roadside, never buried, never counted. Some prisoners simply disappeared. But of the roughly 12,000 Americans who started the march, perhaps 10,000 survived. Of the 63,000 Filipinos, the death toll was proportionally even higher. The Filipino soldiers endured even worse treatment than the Americans. When the survivors finally stumbled through the gates of Camp O'Donnell, many believed the worst was over. They thought that now, in an established camp, they would receive food, water, shelter, and medical care. They were wrong. If anything, what awaited them at Camp O'Donnell was worse than the march itself. Camp O'Donnell was supposed to be a prisoner of war camp. In reality, it was a death camp, located in Cape's Tarlac province, about 7 miles from the railhead. Camp O'Donnell had originally been constructed as a training base for the Philippine Army. It was never designed to be a POW camp. The facilities were primitive bamboo barracks with thatched roofs, dirt floors, no plumbing, no sanitation system. The camp had been designed to house perhaps 10,000 soldiers in training. Now, over 60,000 prisoners, American and Filipino, were crammed into its confines. The overcrowding was catastrophic. On the day the first prisoners arrived, they were assembled and addressed by the camp commandant, Captain Yoshio Tsunoshi. His speech set the tone for what was to come. Tsunoyoshi made it clear that he and his guards held the prisoners in utter contempt. They had surrendered. They were cowards. They deserved no respect and no mercy. The conditions at Camp O'Donnell were, in the words of one historian, comparable to Andersonville, the infamous Confederate prison camp of the American Civil War, where thousands of Union soldiers died from disease and neglect. The most critical problem was water. The camp had almost no water supply, just one contaminated creek and a few spigots that produced only a trickle. With thousands of men in the camp, obtaining water became an all-consuming struggle. Men would stand in line all day in the tropical sun, waiting for their turn at a spigot, only to receive a few drops of water in their canteen. The securing of water became the prime concern of everyone, from General King down to the lowest privates, one officer wrote. Seems like the only people who weren't in line were those who had already gotten their ration. Men died standing in the water line. They would collapse from heat and exhaustion, and their bodies would be dragged aside so the line could continue. Each prisoner was allowed one canteen of water per day for drinking, cooking, and washing. It was nowhere near enough. The lack of water had cascading effects. Men couldn't wash. With dysentery rampant, prisoners were covered in their own filth. There was no water to wash off the fecal matter from the men's bodies, one survivor recalled. The combination of severe dehydration and dysentery was particularly deadly. Men would feel a desperate urge to urinate, but could produce only a few drops, accompanied by excruciating pain. Going 9 days without a bowel movement due to dehydration was common. Then the dysentery would hit, and men would have uncontrollable diarrhea. 30, 40, 50 times a day, losing what little fluid remained in their bodies. Food was almost as scarce as water. Prisoners received 2 meals a day, rice and thin vegetable soup, occasionally with a few shreds of water buffalo meat. The daily ration provided perhaps 1,500 calories, far below what the human body needs, especially for men trying to recover from the march. The diet was deficient in protein and vitamins. Cases of beriberi, pellagra, and other deficiency diseases multiplied. The hospital, if it could be called that, consisted of 5 bamboo buildings with minimal medical supplies. It became known as the House of Horrors. The buildings were filled with men dying of dysentery, malaria, beriberi, and starvation. The smell was indescribable: human waste, rotting flesh, death. Men lay on the dirt or bamboo floors in their own filth, too weak to move, waiting to die. Doctors and medics did what they could, but they had almost no medicines, no equipment, no supplies. They could only watch as their patients died. Many prisoners preferred to stay outside the hospital. believing they had a better chance of survival if they avoided the concentration of disease inside. The death toll was staggering. In the first 2 months of the camp's operation, prisoners were dying at a rate of 350 to 400 per day minus 20 to 30. Americans and 300 to 350 Filipinos. By summer 1942, over 27,000 prisoners had died at Camp O'Donnell, 1,500 Americans, and about 26,000 Filipinos. The Japanese refused most offers of outside assistance, including help from the Philippine Red Cross. They insisted they were treating the prisoners in accordance with their own standards, never mind that those standards violated every principle of the Geneva Convention. For many prisoners, the psychological toll was as devastating as the physical suffering. Corpsman Malcolm Amos, survivor of the Death March, now watched helplessly as men around him gave up. "When a man doesn't want to live," one soldier wrote, "it is pretty easy to die." Many simply gave up and did just that, with nothing more wrong with them than any of the rest of us. Some men stopped eating, deciding that death was preferable to this existence. Their friends would try to force-feed them, begging them to hold on. Sometimes it worked, often it didn't. The death toll fell particularly heavily on the young. Almost 2/3 of American deaths at Camp O'Donnell were men aged 25 or under. Lieutenant Colonel David Hardy, a World War I veteran, observed, "Young men were more easily discouraged, because, for the first time, they were meeting adversity, while older men had gone through many hard knocks. Young bodies were tender and had little surplus. Older bodies were tough and had old gristle that furnished fat for the body for weeks." Many of these younger men had not learned the deep lesson of life, that happiness is a thing that springs from within. One evening, an officer heard a young soldier calling out for his mother, his voice growing weaker and weaker until it finally stopped. The hysterical sobs and pleading went on endlessly, rending the hearts who heard the pathetic young man, the officer recalled. By June 1942, the Japanese presented the American prisoners with some bags of cement. The prisoners decided to build a memorial, a cement cross to honor their dead. They completed it and placed it in a hidden area of the camp, where it stood as a silent testament to the thousands who had died there. After the war, this cross was discovered, preserved, and eventually brought to the United States, where it remains as a powerful symbol of suffering and sacrifice. In mid-1942, the Japanese began moving American prisoners out of Camp O'Donnell to other camps. Many went to Cabanatuan, another POW camp, where conditions were slightly better. Others were selected for work details, but the worst fate was reserved for those selected to be transported to Japan itself for slave labor. These transports came to be known as hell ships. The Japanese used unmarked merchant vessels to transport prisoners. The ships were not marked as carrying POWs, which meant they were legitimate targets for Allied submarines and aircraft. The prisoners would be packed into the cargo holds, sometimes thousands of men crammed into spaces designed for a fraction of that number. There was no ventilation, no sanitation, minimal food and water. The conditions were nightmarish. Men were packed so tightly they couldn't sit down or lie down properly. The heat in the holds was suffocating. Prisoners died from heat stroke, suffocation, dehydration, and disease. When men died, their bodies would sometimes remain in the holds for days. Paul Kirkham, the survivor who had walked the death march in the middle line, was loaded onto one of these hell ships. He survived the voyage to Japan, where he would spend the rest of the war as a slave laborer in a coal mine. Lester Tenney was also transported on a hell ship. He survived the passage and ended up in forced labor in Japan, enduring beatings, starvation, and brutal treatment for over 3 years. Then came the ultimate horror: American submarines and aircraft, not knowing that the unmarked Japanese ships carried Allied POWs, attacked them. Over 20,000 Allied prisoners died at sea, killed by their own side's attacks on the ships transporting them. The most infamous hell ship was the Oryaku Maru. On December 13, 1944, approximately 1,620 American POWs were loaded into the holds of this merchant ship. The next day, American aircraft attacked the ship, not knowing it carried American prisoners. The ship was badly damaged and eventually sunk. The survivors were transferred to other ships, which were also attacked. Of the 1,620 men who boarded Oryoku Maru in December 1944, only about 450 survived to the end of the war, a survival rate of less than 30%. But even as thousands died in camps and on hell ships, a small flame of resistance continued to burn. Some prisoners escaped from the camps and joined Filipino guerrilla forces fighting in the mountains. These guerrillas, Filipino soldiers and civilians who refused to surrender, conducted raids against the Japanese, gathered intelligence, and helped Allied forces when they eventually returned, and the survivors kept hoping. They believed that someday, somehow, liberation would come. They held on to General MacArthur's promise, "I shall return." October 20th, 1944, Leyte Island, Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur waded ashore from a landing craft onto a Philippine beach. Behind him, American forces were returning to the Philippines in overwhelming strength. Before cameras and microphones, MacArthur declared, "People of the Philippines, I have returned." It had taken 2.5 years, but MacArthur had kept his promise. As American forces advanced through the Philippines in late 1944 and early 1945, they began to liberate the prisoner of war camps. One of the most dramatic rescues occurred on January 30th, 1945, at Cabanatuan, where over 500 American and Allied POs were still being held. In a daring raid, U.S. Army Rangers, Alamo Scouts, and Filipino guerrillas infiltrated 30 miles behind Japanese lines, attacked the camp in a nighttime assault, killed hundreds of Japanese guards, and rescued the prisoners. It was one of the most successful rescue operations of the war. When the rescuers arrived, they found men who were shadows of their former selves, emaciated, sick, many barely able to walk, but they were alive, and they could finally tell their stories. The stories they told shocked the American public. The Death March, the camps, the hell ships. These were atrocities that demanded justice. After Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, Allied forces began rounding up Japanese military personnel for war crimes trials. In the Philippines, the U.S. Army conducted trials from 1945 to 1947, prosecuting around 200 Japanese military personnel for war crimes related to the Bataan Death March and the treatment of POWs. The most prominent trial was that of General Masaharu Hama. He was arrested in September 1945, extradited to the Philippines, and tried by an American military tribunal on 48 counts of violating international rules of war. The trial began in January 1946. The prosecution presented testimony from survivors describing the beatings, executions, starvation, and abuse during the march and in the camps. The key question was whether Hama had ordered these atrocities or had failed to prevent them. Hama's defense was that he had been preoccupied with planning the assault on Corregidor and had delegated the handling of prisoners to his staff. He claimed he didn't learn of the atrocities until after the war, even though his headquarters had been only 500 feet from the route of the march. "I came to know for the first time in the court of the atrocities, and I am ashamed of myself should these atrocities have happened," Hama testified. The tribunal was not convinced. On February 11, 1946, Hama was convicted on all counts and sentenced to death by firing squad. His wife traveled to Tokyo to plead with General MacArthur, who was now the supreme commander of Allied forces in Japan, to commute the sentence. MacArthur met with her in what he called one of the most trying hours of my life, but he upheld the conviction. "If this defendant does not deserve his judicial fate, none in jurisdictional history ever did," MacArthur stated. "There can be no greater, more heinous, or more dangerous crime than the mass destruction, under guise of military authority, of helpless men." On April 3, 1946, Hama was executed by firing squad at Los Barras, a former internment camp south of Manila. Some historians have questioned whether Hama personally ordered the atrocities, or whether he was held responsible for a failure of command and control. But there is no question that the atrocities occurred under his overall command. Many other Japanese officers and soldiers were tried for their roles in the Death March and camp atrocities. Some were executed. Others received long prison sentences. Meanwhile, the survivors were returning home. Of the approximately 12,000 Americans captured on Bataan, only about 4,000 survived the war. A death rate of about two-thirds. The Philippine casualties were even more staggering. Of the 63,000 Filipino soldiers captured, tens of thousands died on the march, in the camps, or as slave laborers. The survivors faced enormous challenges adjusting to civilian life. Many suffered from what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder, though it wasn't recognized or treated at the time. They had nightmares. They couldn't talk about what they had experienced. Physical ailments from malnutrition, disease, and abuse plagued them for the rest of their lives. Paul Kirkham, who survived the march, the camps, and slave labor in Japan, lived to be 102 years old, one of the longest-lived survivors. But for decades, he never spoke about his experiences. Only in his later years did he begin sharing his story, speaking at schools and events to ensure that the younger generation would know what had happened. In the decades after the war, survivors and their families worked to ensure that the Bataan Death March would not be forgotten. Memorials were erected in the Philippines, in the United States, and at sites around the world. In the Philippines, on Mount Samot, in Bataan, the Filipino government constructed the Dambana ng Kagitingan, the Shrine of Valor. At its center stands a massive memorial cross, 312 feet tall, the second tallest cross in the world. From the viewing gallery in the cross, visitors can look out over Bataan Peninsula, where the battle was fought and the march began. The shrine complex includes a museum with exhibits about the battle, the Death March, and the soldiers who fought there. In the United States, memorials honor both the defenders of Bataan and the survivors of the Death March. At Camp O'Donnell in the Philippines, a cement cross erected by the prisoners themselves was preserved after the war and eventually brought to Andersonville, Georgia, the site of the Civil War prison camp, where it stands as a reminder of American POWs suffering across different wars. Beginning in 1992, the Bataan Memorial Death March has been held annually at White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico. Participants, including military personnel, civilians, and, for many years, survivors of the actual march, walk or run a marathon distance course through the desert to honor those who suffered and died. The event has grown to attract thousands of participants. For many years, survivors attended and even walked portions of the course. Ben Scarden, a survivor who became a professor at Clemson University, participated in the Memorial March 11 times between his 90th birthday and age 100. Until his death, he was the oldest participant and the only survivor to regularly walk the course. While I walk, it seems to me, my memory flashes back, and I get emotional, Scarden said. The Memorial March serves multiple purposes. It honors those who suffered and died. It educates new generations about the history, and it reminds participants, especially military personnel, of the importance of resilience, of never giving up, no matter how difficult circumstances become. The legacy of the Bataan Death March extends beyond memorials and annual marches. It influenced how the U.S. military trains its soldiers, particularly in survival, evasion, resistance, and escape SEER training. The lessons learned from survivors like Lester Tenney about setting goals, maintaining hope, and finding reasons to persevere are now taught to service members. The Death March also affected international law. The trials of Japanese officers for war crimes contributed to the development of modern international humanitarian law and the laws governing the treatment of prisoners of war. The Geneva Conventions were updated and strengthened after World War II, in part because of atrocities like the Bataan Death March. Perhaps most importantly, the Death March serves as a stark reminder of what can happen when human beings are viewed as less than human, when contempt and cruelty override basic decency. The Japanese soldiers who committed these atrocities had been taught that surrender was shameful, that prisoners were contemptible. This cultural and military conditioning enabled ordinary soldiers to commit extraordinary acts of cruelty. For the survivors, the journey to peace was long and difficult. Many struggled with survivors' guilt, wondering why they had lived when so many of their comrades had died. Some, like Lester Tenney, spent years trying to get the Japanese government to formally apologize and acknowledge what had happened. It wasn't until the 1990s and 2000s that Japanese officials began offering formal apologies to former people. Today, fewer than a handful of Bataan Death March survivors remain alive. Lester Tenney died in 2017 at age 96. Paul Kirkham died in the early 2020s at 102. With each passing year, more survivors are lost. From the Bataan Death March, "I don't think there's 10 men left alive today," Tenney said in an interview years before his death. As the last survivors pass away, the responsibility for remembering shifts to the rest of us. The survivors wanted their stories told, not for glory or recognition, but to ensure that future generations understand what happened, understand the cost of war, and understand the resilience of the human spirit. 75,000 men surrendered on April 9, 1942. Within a year, more than half were dead. By the end of the war, 2/3 of the Americans and an even higher proportion of the Filipinos had perished from the march, from the camps, from disease, from abuse, from the hell ships. These were not statistics. These were fathers and sons, brothers and friends. They were young men who had answered their nation's call, who had fought with courage against overwhelming odds, who had endured months of starvation and disease, and who then faced an ordeal that many did not survive. The Bataan Death March stands as one of the darkest chapters of World War II, a stark reminder of what happens when the rules of war are abandoned, when prisoners are viewed with contempt rather than treated with basic human dignity. But it's also a story of resilience. Lester Tenney's goals, his determination to reach the next landmark, and then the next one, and then the next one. Paul Kirkham's decision to stay in the middle of the column, to keep his head down, to keep moving. Ben Scarden's refusal to forget, his commitment to walking that memorial march year after year into his 100th year of life. These men showed us that even in the darkest circumstances, even when death seems inevitable, the human spirit can endure. They survived, not because they were superheroes, but because they refused to give up. They set goals. They helped each other when they could. They maintained hope, even when hope seemed impossible. For those who didn't survive, we carry their memory. The cement cross from Camp O'Donnell, the memorial cross on Mount Sama, the annual march at White Sands. These are not just monuments to the dead. They are promises to the living that we will not forget. As we remember the Bataan Death March, we must ask ourselves, what would we have done in their situation? Could we have kept going? Would we have had the strength to survive? More importantly, we must commit ourselves to ensuring that such atrocities never happen again. The laws of war, the Geneva Conventions, the international humanitarian laws that govern the treatment of prisoners. These exist because of events, like the Bataan Death March. They are written in the blood of those who suffered and died. To the survivors who shared their stories, your courage in surviving was matched only by your courage in speaking about what you endured. You wanted us to remember, and we will. To those who died on the march, in the camps, on the hell ships, your sacrifice is not forgotten. The battles you fought, the suffering you endured, the lives you gave. These are part of our history, part of our national memory. The last survivors are nearly gone. Soon there will be no one left who walked that road, who endured those camps, who can speak from personal experience about what happened. When that day comes, the story of the Bataan Death March will pass from living memory to history. But it doesn't have to be forgotten. As long as we continue to tell this story, as long as we continue to honor these men, as long as we remember both the horror of what happened and the courage of those who endured it, they live on. Remember Bataan. Remember the march. Remember the men who walked it. Remember why they fought. Remember what they suffered. And remember that in our darkest moments, the human spirit, with courage, determination, and hope, endure even the unendurable.